Beneath China's vast network of lakes and reservoirs lies a secret older than the written word. Cities frozen in time, streets carved from stone, and temples aligned to stars long forgotten. From the murky depths of artificial lakes to ancient waterways that have guarded their treasures for millennia, this land holds more than just water and fish. It holds the remnants of civilizations that vanished before history could record their names. And in the silence beneath the surface, something ancient is waiting to be remembered. The water is cold, dark, silent in a way that feels unnatural. A diver descends through the murk, his headlamp cutting a narrow cone of light through the suspended sediment. 30 feet down, 40. The visibility drops to almost nothing. Just green-black water and the steady rhythm of his breathing through the regulator. Then, without warning, the bottom appears. Not soft mud or scattered rocks, but something else entirely. Stone, flat, deliberate, arranged. He sweeps his light across the lakebed, and his breath catches. A street. An actual paved street stretching into the darkness, lined with what looks like the foundations of buildings. Walls emerge from the silt, some still standing 4 or 5 feet tall. Doorways frame passages that lead nowhere now, just deeper into the drowned world. And carved into a fallen lintel, weathered but unmistakable, are symbols, writing. Someone lived here once, walked these streets, carved these stones, built this city with purpose and care. And then the water came. He hovers there, suspended above the silent ruins, and feels the weight of a question settle over him like the lake itself. How does an entire city just disappear beneath the water? And more unsettling still, how many more are down here, waiting in the dark? The diver's name was Chen Wei, and the year was 2001. He wasn't looking for anything in particular that day. Just doing routine survey work for a dam expansion project in Zhejiang province. The lake where he dove, Qiandao Lake, better known as Thousand Island Lake, had been created in 1959 when the Shannon River was dammed. Officials at the time knew they were flooding 2 ancient counties, Xicheng and Hecheng, but the emphasis was on progress, hydroelectric power, and modernization. The old towns were evacuated, their people relocated. What happened to the buildings, the temples, the history carved into those stones? No one seemed to care much. They were sacrificed to the new China. And for 40 years, they sat beneath hundreds of feet of water, forgotten, until Chen Wei's light found them again. When he surfaced and reported what he'd seen, the initial reaction was skepticism. Old foundations maybe, colonial-era structures at best, but Chen insisted. He'd seen intact architecture, deliberate urban planning, inscriptions that looked far older than anything from the Qing dynasty. A small team of archaeologists and divers went down to confirm his findings. What they discovered stunned them. Xicheng, the Lion City, was almost perfectly preserved. Built during the Eastern Han Dynasty, around 208 CE, and expanded through the Tang and Ming periods, the city had been a thriving regional hub for over 1,700 years. Its stone walls, archways, temples, and residential quarters had survived nearly untouched beneath the lake. The cold, oxygen-poor water had protected the wood and stonework from decay. It was, in effect, a time capsule. And it wasn't alone. But here's what haunts researchers about discoveries like these. It's not just what the water reveals. It's what it still hides, because China's relationship with water runs deeper than dams and development. The water here doesn't just drown cities, it keeps secrets. And the more you look beneath the surface, the more you realize those secrets follow a pattern. China has a strange relationship with water in history. The nation's geography, its rivers, lakes, coastlines have always been central to civilization. The Yellow River, the Yangtze, the countless tributaries that feed them. These waterways have nourished empires, but they've also swallowed them. Over millennia, floods have reshaped the land, earthquakes have redirected rivers, and in the modern era, dam projects have drowned entire valleys. The result is a landscape riddled with submerged ruins, most of which remain unmapped and unstudied. Xicheng might be the most famous, but it's far from the only one. There's Hecheng, the other city drowned by Qiandao Lake. While Xicheng gets the tourist boats and the documentary crews, Hecheng sits in deeper water, less accessible, less explored. Early reports from divers who ventured there describe streets wider than those in Xicheng, defensive walls that suggest greater military importance, and temple complexes that dwarf anything found in its sister city. But documentation is sparse. The government has restricted access, citing safety concerns and the need to preserve what remains. Some archaeologists believe He Cheng might actually be older than Shi Cheng, possibly dating back to the Three Kingdoms period, or even earlier. If that's true, it could rewrite our understanding of urban development in southern China. But without proper excavation, it's all speculation. Then there are the Baiheliang underwater inscriptions near Fuling, stone carvings dating back over 1,000 years, now submerged by the Three Gorges Dam. Entire villages, bridges, and temples scattered beneath reservoirs across Hubei, Sichuan, and Yunnan. Some were documented before flooding. Most were not. And then there are the ones that vanished long before modern dams existed. Natural disasters, climate shifts, tectonic activity. China's history is full of cities that simply disappeared, swallowed by rising water or collapsing land. The question isn't whether more ruins exist beneath China's waters. The question is how many. And whether what they reveal about China's past is something history was meant to remember, or something it was meant to forget. Because when you start looking at the pattern, when you map where these submerged cities cluster and compare them to gaps in the historical record, something unsettling emerges. These aren't random losses. They're systematic, as if entire chapters of Chinese civilization were deliberately written out of existence, and the water became their tomb and their archive both. The legends begin where the facts run out, and in China, that's often where the real story starts. In the villages around Qiandao Lake, elders still tell stories their grandparents told them. Stories of a kingdom that angered the heavens and was swallowed by the earth in a single night. They speak of a ruler, proud and ambitious, who built a great city and claimed dominion over the valley. But he grew arrogant, they say, demanding tribute from neighboring towns and refusing to honor the Tao, gods. Warnings came in the form of tremors and strange lights in the sky. Animals fled the valley. Birds circled endlessly without landing. And then, one night, the ground opened. Water surged from beneath the city, flooding streets, collapsing buildings, dragging everything down into a newly formed chasm that became a lake. By morning, the city was gone. Only the peaks of nearby hills remained above water, forming the islands that dot the lake today. It's easy to dismiss these tales as folklore, the kind of morality stories cultures tell to explain natural disasters. But here's the thing. These stories exist all over China. Different regions, different lakes, but the same basic structure. A prosperous city, a catastrophic flood, a landscape transformed overnight. The myths surrounding Dongting Lake in Hunan speak of drowned palaces and ghostly lights. Stories from Poyang Lake mention entire fleets of ships that sank during storms, their crews never recovered. And in the far west, near the Tibetan plateau, there are legends of sacred cities submerged when glacial lakes burst their banks. The consistency is eerie. Either every culture in China independently invented the same flood myth, or these stories are echoes of real events, catastrophes so devastating they were seared into collective memory and passed down through generations. Modern archaeology has started to take these legends seriously. Not literally, perhaps, but as potential guides to lost sites. Time and again, researchers have found that oral traditions, even when wrapped in myth, often point toward real historical events. The Great Flood of Chinese mythology, the one involving the legendary figures Gun and Yu, was long considered pure legend. But geological studies have now confirmed that around 1920 BCE, a massive landslide dammed the Yellow River, creating a lake that eventually burst and sent catastrophic floods downstream. The event matches the mythological timeline almost exactly. So, when villagers say their ancestors spoke of a drowned kingdom, it's worth paying attention, because somewhere beneath the water, there might be proof. And in one particular case, that proof has started to emerge in ways that challenge everything we thought we understood about China's ancient past. What if the legends aren't just preserving memory of natural disasters? What if they're preserving something else? Something that makes certain people uncomfortable? The idea that China's history isn't as linear, as unified, or as completely understood as official narratives suggest. The first organized dive into what would later be called the Ruins of the Forgotten Kingdom took place in 2003. A joint team from Zhejiang University and the Chinese Academy of Sciences received permission to conduct underwater surveys in a remote section of Qiandao Lake, far from the tourist areas where Shi Cheng had become a minor attraction. The location was chosen based on local stories and anomalies in sonar scans. The lake bottom showed unusual geometric patterns, straight lines and right angles that didn't match natural formations. The dive leader was Dr. Lu Xiang, an archaeologist specializing in pre-Qin dynasty cultures. He'd heard the legends, read the survey reports, and was skeptical but intrigued. When he descended that first time, equipped with high-powered underwater lights and a full camera rig, he expected to find maybe some old foundations, perhaps remnants of a village flooded when the dam was built. What he found instead made him question everything he thought he knew about early Chinese civilization. The water at that depth, nearly 200 feet down, was pitch black. The cold seeped through his dry suit within minutes. Visibility was less than 10 feet, even with the lights. But as he descended the final 30 feet, shapes began to emerge from the gloom. A wall, massive, constructed from precisely cut stone blocks, each one weighing hundreds of pounds. The surface was smooth, fitted together without visible mortar. The seams so tight a blade couldn't slip between them. He followed the wall, his light playing across its surface, and found a gateway. An actual arched entrance, the keystone still in place, leading into what had once been the city. Inside, the layout was unmistakable. Streets intersected at right angles. Building foundations formed neat rows. And everywhere, carved into doorframes, lintels, and freestanding steels, were inscriptions. Some were in recognizable classical Chinese characters, but others, the older ones, were different, more pictographic, angular, almost primitive. They resembled Oracle bone script, but weren't quite the same. Dr. Liu carefully photographed everything, noting locations, taking measurements. When he surfaced hours later, he was shaking, not from the cold, but from the implications of what he'd seen. Over the following months, the team conducted dozens of dives, gradually mapping the submerged city. What they discovered was staggering in scope. The site covered nearly half a square kilometer, making it far larger than Xicheng. The urban layout suggested sophisticated planning. A central plaza, likely used for markets or gatherings, with major thoroughfares radiating outward. Defensive walls enclosed the city on 3 sides, the 4th side open to what must have been the original riverbank. Most impressive was the drainage system. Stone channels, some large enough to walk through, crisscrossed beneath the streets, designed to carry runoff and sewage away from populated areas. This was advanced engineering, the kind typically associated with later dynasties, not early settlements. And yet, based on the architectural style and the few datable artifacts recovered, the city appeared to be incredibly old. Preliminary estimates placed it somewhere between 1,500 and 1000 BCE, the late Shang to early Zhou period. But even that seemed too recent. Something about the construction, methods, the tool marks on the stones, suggested it might be older still. The architecture itself was a puzzle. Most ancient Chinese structures from that period were built primarily of wood, with stone used sparingly for foundations or ceremonial buildings, but this city was almost entirely stone. The walls were massive, some sections still standing over 10 feet tall despite centuries underwater. The blocks showed evidence of precise cutting, as if the builders had access to metal tools far more advanced than the bronze implements known from that era. Even more curious, the masonry style didn't match any known regional tradition. It resembled, in some ways, the stonework of the Liangzhu culture, which flourished in the Yangtze Delta around 3,300 to 2,300 BCE. But Liangzhu sites were typically smaller, more focused on ritual architecture than urban planning. This was different. This was a city built to last, built by people who understood engineering, hydrology, and urban design in ways that shouldn't have existed in that time and place. Then, there were the temples. 3 large structures clustered near the city center, each one oriented along a precise north-south axis. Dr. Liu's team carefully surveyed them, noting that the alignment wasn't arbitrary. One temple's entrance faced due south, toward the winter solstice sunrise. Another pointed southeast, aligned with the spring equinox. The third, the largest, had a courtyard with a series of stone pillars arranged in a circle. When the team measured the angles between the pillars and ran computer simulations, they found something remarkable. The pillars tracked the movement of certain constellations, particularly the Big Dipper and the stars of the Vermilion Bird constellation, which were significant in ancient Chinese astronomy. This wasn't just a city, it was an astronomical observatory, a place where ancient priests or scholars watched the heavens, tracked seasons, and possibly made predictions based on celestial movements. The level of astronomical knowledge required to build such a structure was thought to belong to later periods, the Han Dynasty, or even the Tang. Yet here it was, submerged beneath a lake, dating to a time when Chinese civilization was supposedly still in its infancy. The discovery sent ripples through the archaeological community. If the dating was accurate, this city predated most known Chinese urban centers. It suggested a level of cultural sophistication that didn't fit the established timeline. Some researchers argued the site must be younger, that the dating methods were flawed or contaminated. Others proposed it was a regional anomaly, an isolated pocket of advanced culture that developed independently and was later absorbed or destroyed by expanding dynasties. But a few, a small but vocal group, suggested something more radical. What if this city wasn't an anomaly? What if it represented a lost branch of Chinese civilization, one that thrived long before the Xia, Shang, and Zhou dynasties, and was then forgotten, erased from history by floods, wars, or deliberate suppression? And that's where the water becomes more than just a preserver of ruins. It becomes a vault, a place where inconvenient histories can be buried, literally and figuratively. Because if there's one thing China's long imperial tradition excelled at, it was controlling the narrative. New dynasties erased old ones. Conquerors rewrote the stories of the conquered. And anything that didn't fit the approved version of history, it disappeared. Sometimes into flames, sometimes into archives no one was allowed to read. And sometimes, perhaps, beneath water, where it would never challenge the official story again. The inscriptions became the focus of intense study. Divers carefully photographed hundreds of carved characters, bringing the images to linguists and epigraphers for analysis. What they found was both fascinating and frustrating. Some of the symbols were recognizable, variants of characters used in classical Chinese. But many were not. They resembled Proto-Chinese writing, the kind seen in Shang dynasty oracle bones, but with significant differences. Some characters appeared to be pictographs, simple representations of objects like fish, mountains, or the sun. Others were more abstract, geometric patterns that might represent concepts or sounds. And then there were the truly mysterious ones, symbols that didn't match any known writing system, not Chinese, not anything from neighboring cultures. One inscription, carved into a large stele near the central plaza, became known as the Forbidden Text. It consisted of over 200 characters arranged in vertical columns, but fewer than half could be reliably translated. The readable portions spoke of a great ruler, a flood, and a covenant with the heavens. The rest remained stubbornly indecipherable. Linguistic teams from Beijing and Shanghai compared the inscriptions to every known early writing system in East Asia. They found tantalizing similarities. Some characters matched Longshan culture pottery marks from around 2500 BCE. Others resembled symbols found at Liangzhu sites. A few bore a passing resemblance to even older Neolithic markings discovered in the Yellow River Valley. The consensus, tentative as it was, suggested the inscriptions represented a transitional writing system, something that bridged the gap between purely pictographic symbols and the more sophisticated logographic script that would later evolve into classical Chinese. If that was true, it meant this city was a missing link, a crucial piece in understanding how Chinese civilization developed its written language. But there was a problem. Some of the mathematical and astronomical notations found in the temple inscriptions were far too advanced for that period. They included calculations for lunar cycles, seasonal variations, and what appeared to be early forms of algebraic notation. That level of mathematical sophistication shouldn't have existed in China until at least the late Zhou period, 1,000 years later. So how did these people, whoever they were, know what they knew? That's the question that keeps coming up, the one that makes mainstream archaeologists uncomfortable and gives alternative historians ammunition for more radical theories. But before we go down that road, we need to understand something else. Something about how knowledge disappears. Because it's not always natural. Sometimes it's deliberate. Sometimes what looks like loss is actually erasure. Working underwater is brutal. The cold saps your strength within an hour. Visibility shifts unpredictably. One moment you can see 15 feet, the next you're blind, surrounded by swirling sediment stirred up by your own movements. Equipment fails in ways it never does on land. Cameras flood despite careful sealing. Lights short out from pressure or moisture. And the structures themselves, fragile. After millennia underwater, collapse at the slightest disturbance. More than once, divers triggered rockfalls, clouds of silt and tumbling stones that could easily trap or injure someone. The team learned to move slowly, carefully, treating the ruins like the delicate artifacts they were. But even with caution, progress was agonizingly slow. A single room might take days to document properly. Larger structures, weeks. And there was always the clock. Dive time was limited by air supply, decompression requirements, and the physical toll the deep, cold water took on the human body. Then there were the bureaucratic challenges. The site, once it became known, attracted attention from multiple government agencies, each with their own agenda. The State Administration of Cultural Heritage wanted strict controls, limited access, maximum preservation. Local authorities saw tourism potential and pushed for opening parts of the site to commercial diving tours. Environmental groups worried about damage to the lake ecosystem. And then there were the political considerations. China's history is a sensitive topic, especially when new discoveries challenge official narratives about the origins and development of Chinese civilization. Research permits were suddenly harder to obtain. Dive schedules were restricted, and certain artifacts, particularly those with controversial implications, were quietly moved to secure facilities and removed from public discussion. Dr. Liu found himself navigating a maze of regulations and unspoken pressures, trying to balance scientific integrity with the realities of working in a country where history and politics are deeply intertwined. There were stranger difficulties too. Equipment malfunctioned in ways the engineers couldn't explain. Compasses spun wildly near certain sections of the ruins, making navigation treacherous. Underwater cameras captured odd distortions, shapes in the background that looked almost like figures but vanished when reviewed frame by frame. Some divers reported unusual sounds, deep thrumming noises that seemed to come from beneath the lakebed, like distant machinery or something massive stirring in the depths. Temperature readings fluctuated wildly, pockets of water 20 degrees colder than surrounding areas with no geological explanation. Some divers, particularly those who spent extended time near the temples, reported vivid dreams after surfacing. Dreams of firelit rituals, chanting in an unknown language, and a sense of being watched by something ancient and patient. One incident, never officially reported but widely discussed among the dive teams, involved a structural collapse in what was believed to be a storage chamber beneath one of the temples. 3 divers were working inside when part of the ceiling gave way. They escaped unharmed, but when they returned the next day, they found something that hadn't been visible before. A deeper chamber, revealed by the collapse, with walls covered in deliberately burned markings. And in the center of the floor were human remains. Not a burial, not a neat arrangement of bones, but scattered, jumbled, as if people had died suddenly and violently. Analysis later determined there were at least 7 individuals. The bones showed no signs of trauma. They had simply died, all at once, in this sealed chamber. Nearby were tools, stone orbs perfectly spherical, metal rods inscribed with geometric patterns, and a jade disc carved with symbols that didn't match any known iconography. The artifacts tell a story, though not always a clear one. Most of what was recovered fits expectations for a late Shang or early Zhou settlement. Bronze vessels, ceramic jars, stone tools, jade ornaments. But mixed in were anomalies. The jade disc was flawless, perfectly circular, with intricate carvings that required microscopic precision. Modern jewelers examined it and confirmed that creating such an object, even with contemporary tools, would be extraordinarily difficult. Doing it with Neolithic or Bronze Age technology should have been impossible. Then there was the bronze vessel, sealed with a complex lid mechanism. When archaeologists finally opened it, they found residue, a thick substance that chemical analysis revealed was organic, plant-based, but contained compounds that didn't match any known ancient Chinese recipes. Some elements suggested it was medicinal or possibly psychoactive. Others pointed to ritual use. The tools raised their own questions. Most were stone or bronze, typical for the period, but a few were different. There were cutting implements made from an alloy that contained iron, which shouldn't have been smelted in China until the late Zhou period, centuries after this city was supposedly built. Another find, a set of precision measuring instruments, suggested advanced mathematical knowledge. The most controversial artifacts were the carvings that some researchers believed depicted celestial events. One showed a circle with a tail, unmistakably comet-like. Another series depicted what looked like a solar eclipse. If these were indeed records of astronomical events, they could be used to date the carvings with incredible precision. But here's what connects all of this: the inscriptions that can't be read, the technology that shouldn't exist, the astronomical knowledge that seems impossibly advanced. They all point to the same unsettling possibility, that what we think we know about China's past is incomplete. That beneath the official history, beneath the neat progression of dynasties and the unified narrative of 5,000 years of continuous civilization, there are gaps. Blank spaces where entire cultures existed and then vanished, leaving only traces for us to puzzle over. And water, it seems, is where those traces go to hide, or to be hidden. Trying to understand who built this city means piecing together fragments. The mainstream theory suggests it was built by a regional culture, possibly a branch of the Shang dynasty, or a contemporary civilization that developed independently in the Yangtze Valley. Another hypothesis ties the site to the Liangzhu culture. But there's a timing problem. Liangzhu collapsed around 2300 BCE, 1,000 years before this city appears to have been built. Some researchers propose a third option, that the city was built by a transitional society, one that existed in the gap between the collapse of Liangzhou and the rise of the Shang. The social structure of the city can be inferred from its layout. The central area, with its temples and large buildings, was clearly reserved for elites. Further out, residential areas showed more variation. The city wasn't egalitarian. There was hierarchy, privilege, specialization. But there was also evidence of communal spaces, shared wells, the drainage system. This was a functioning society, complex and organized. But here's what haunts researchers. There's no clear connection between this city and any known later culture. When the site was abandoned, its people didn't just move somewhere else and continue their traditions. They vanished. No descendant cultures, no oral histories, nothing. It's as if an entire society was simply erased. Some argue this is because the city's destruction was so complete that no survivors remained. Others believe the people were absorbed into expanding Shang or Zhou territories, their identity dissolved. But there's a third possibility. What if the city wasn't destroyed by natural disaster alone? What if it was deliberately erased, buried, and forgotten by a rival power that wanted no trace of its existence to remain? Ancient Chinese history is full of dynastic struggles where entire populations were relocated or eliminated and records burned. It's possible this city met that fate. Conquered, its people scattered or killed, its name struck from every record. And then, the water came, whether by natural flood or deliberate engineering, sealing the evidence beneath hundreds of feet of silent darkness. Because that's the other pattern you notice when you look at China's submerged ruins. They're not evenly distributed. They cluster in regions that were contested during certain periods, border zones between rival states, areas that changed hands multiple times. As if the water wasn't just burying cities but erasing them, making it impossible for anyone to prove they ever existed at all. The question of why the city ended up underwater is almost as intriguing as what the city was. The most straightforward explanation is that it was flooded when the lake formed, either naturally or artificially. But the evidence from the ruins suggests something more dramatic. The sediment layers show signs of rapid deposition, not slow accumulation. That points to a catastrophic flood event. Geological surveys have identified several possible causes. One theory involves an upstream landslide. If a massive rockfall blocked a river, water would accumulate, and eventually the dam would fail, sending a wall of water downstream. Another possibility is a seismic event. The region sits near active fault lines. A strong quake could have triggered landslides or caused the ground to subside. But here's where the folklore becomes relevant again. The legends speak of the flood happening in one night. Geological evidence supports rapid flooding. The artifacts, tools left mid-use, suggest the inhabitants were going about their daily lives when disaster struck. If this matches the mythological timeline, then the legend isn't metaphor, it's memory. One theory connects the flood to a broader climatic event. Around 1200 BCE, there was a period of significant environmental upheaval across the globe. The Mediterranean civilizations experienced the Late Bronze Age collapse. In China, this period corresponds to the transition from Shang to Zhou, a time of warfare and upheaval. Some researchers believe this wasn't just regional but global, triggered by climate changes. If the underwater city was occupied during this period, it might have been one of many casualties. The Chinese mythological record includes references to a great flood. The most famous version involves Yu the Great, who supposedly tamed the floodwaters. Modern historians have long debated whether Yu was real or mythological, but geological evidence has confirmed that a major flood event did occur on the Yellow River around 1920 BCE. The underwater city might represent a later flood, preserved in local legends but lost from central Chinese mythology. The artifacts that have been recovered represent just a fraction of what must still be down there. Some are utilitarian, the tools of everyday life. Ceramic bowls, storage jars, grinding stones. These are humble objects, but they're also intimate. Someone made each one, used it. But mixed in are the extraordinary items. The jade disc, the sealed bronze vessel, bronze, ritual vessels, stone sculptures. And then there are the small, personal items, jade beads, bone combs, children's toys. These objects weren't made for history. They were made for life. One artifact in particular has captivated researchers, a small, sealed bronze vessel found in the main temple. The vessel was covered in intricate engravings, depicting scenes of daily life, but also stranger images. Figures with elongated limbs, beings that seem to hover, and celestial objects. The vessel was sealed with a wax-like substance. When opened, researchers found a rolled piece of silk inside, partially disintegrated, but with faint traces of ink. The readable fragments spoke of a journey, a sky path, and return to the source. The question of who these people were remains the central mystery. The mainstream theories all have merit, and all have problems. Some researchers have proposed that the city represents something else entirely, an independent civilization that developed in parallel with better-known cultures. This theory is harder to prove because it requires accepting that a major civilization existed and vanished with minimal trace. But it's not impossible. We know now that ancient history is far more complex than 20th century scholars believed. The social hierarchy showed clear stratification. The elites had access to the best of everything. The middle class lived comfortably. The lower classes subsisted on simpler fare, but everyone was connected to the city, dependent on its infrastructure. And everyone, when the flood came, was equally vulnerable. The priests or scholars who managed the temples held significant power from knowledge. They understood the calendar, could predict eclipses, track the stars. But what happened when that knowledge failed? When the flood came despite the rituals? Did survivors lose faith? The archaeological record can't answer these questions, but they're worth asking. The city's destruction marks not just a physical end, but a cultural one. Its language died. Its religious practices vanished. The knowledge encoded in its inscriptions became unreadable. Even its name disappeared. That erasure raises uncomfortable questions. How many other civilizations have been similarly lost? The archaeological record is biased towards stone, metal, and ceramics. Cultures that built with wood, wrote on bark, or bamboo, or silk, have vanished almost completely. And that brings us full circle, back to the water. Because water in China doesn't just hide history. It protects it. Preserves it in cold darkness where it can't be burned, can't be rewritten, can't be erased by anyone who finds the truth inconvenient. The underwater city is a time capsule, yes, but it's also evidence. Proof that China's past is deeper, stranger, and more contested than the official narratives suggest. Proof that civilizations rose and fell long before anyone bothered to record them. And proof that sometimes, the only reason we forget something is because someone wanted us to. Excavation continues, but slowly. Budget constraints are real. Underwater archaeology is expensive. A single dive season can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Funding comes in, fits and starts. Bureaucratic red tape hasn't gotten easier. Every dive requires permits. Every artifact requires documentation. Certain areas have been declared off limits. There's always the underlying tension between preservation and discovery. The sheer difficulty means progress is measured in small increments. Deep sections remain unexplored. Collapsed structures would require specialized techniques. Sealed chambers might contain who knows what. So vast sections of the city remain unknown. The team has mapped perhaps 20% of the total site. They've excavated less than 5%. The rest is still down there, waiting. But the site has attracted attention beyond academia. Documentary crews have filmed there. Tourism companies offer diving expeditions. The local government has invested in infrastructure, a small museum, underwater viewing platforms. It's an attempt to balance protection with access. Meanwhile, the city itself sits in silence. 200 feet below, wrapped in darkness, it waits. Streets that once echoed with voices now only carry slow currents. Temples that once burned with fires now rest in perpetual night. Standing on the shore today, it's nearly impossible to imagine what lies beneath. The water is calm, reflective. Tourist boats motor past. Fishermen tend nets, Families picnic, it's peaceful, but knowing what's down there changes how you see it. The islands aren't just islands. They're hilltops of a valley that was once filled with life. The water isn't just water, it's a veil separating present from past. The implications extend far beyond one city. If this place existed and was forgotten, what else is down there? China's geography is riddled with lakes and reservoirs. Beneath them could be dozens, hundreds of sites. The people who lived there, their contributions, their stories, all lost unless someone looks. That's the real tragedy. Not just that these places were destroyed, but that they were erased from memory. But they did exist. The stones prove it. The inscriptions prove it. The artifacts prove it. And as long as researchers are willing to dive, to map, to puzzle over evidence, the past can be reclaimed. It's slow work, unglamorous, often frustrating, but it matters. It reminds us that civilizations are fragile, that memory is precious, and that the past is never really gone, just hidden, waiting for someone curious enough to pull it back into the light. The city beneath the lake has no name. Dr. Liu's team refers to it by designation, Site QDL7, but that feels inadequate. This was a place with identity, a name spoken by thousands. That name is lost now, but maybe, as excavation continues, it will be found, and when it is, it will feel like restoration. For now, the city sleeps. Wrapped in darkness and silence, the streets are empty. The temples stand open to nothing. The markets lie deserted, but it's not gone. It's waiting. Waiting for the next dive, the next discovery. Waiting for someone to translate just one more inscription, to recognize one more pattern. And as long as there are people willing to do that, the city will never truly be lost. It will live on in the questions it raises, the wonder it inspires, the connections it creates between past and present. The water moves, the lake breathes, and the city waits, silent and patient, for the next person who will dare to remember.